Hey, good evening. It is Tuesday night. We are going to be looking at a question that we get all the time about why is math relevant? The question that probably I've asked a lot too is it's a fair question. Why are some of these things relevant? So I'm Dale Callahan, and I'm the owner of Ask Dr. Callahan, and we're preparing kids, homeschoolers primarily, for college and life. So that question of college and life has come up. Is everybody going to college? Quite frankly, no. Being at a university, I would say one thing that we have at university have to do is we have to learn how to earn value, earn respect, or to show value and earn respect. And sometimes, let's be frank, we don't always do that. But as we're growing, as we're helping our kids grow, more and more kids are turning and saying, I don't want to go to college. I don't have a plan to go to college. There's nothing wrong with that. As a matter of fact, if you look at a lot of the data out there, if you look at just the facts, that's college is not this necessary thing. It's a tool. Education is a tool. One of the things that we're always teaching people is it's great to be educated. As a matter of fact, you need to be educated, but college is not the answer to all education. We don't own education at the university. The education is out there. It's at your fingertips. It's on Facebook, but it's certainly on Google, and it's out there in all many places and forms. But the question does come up then, what do we do? Why do we need math? Why do we need to do math if my kids are not going to college? Now, I'm going to say that question kind of bothers me because what it sounds like is you're giving up on education, period. Now, I'm not talking about just because of math, but you just don't want to do anything education-wise. And that's a terrible decision to make. Because we want our kids, whether they go and pay a university for a school or some training, we want them to constantly learn and grow and have a love for learning and to constantly be getting more and more educated. No matter what they do for a living, their education is going to be critical. If you look at our society and what's going to happen technologically, it doesn't mean they have to be engineers or anything, but they cannot be still. They cannot stay still. They cannot stay with today's information and be ready for what's going on, because it's crazy what's going on in the world and the fast moving pace of innovation and change. But your kids have got to learn and be educated in the sense of understanding what goes on. So let's put it in context of mathematics. Let's say you don't want to go to college. There's two things that happen in mathematics, and one is algebra. I'm going to just take algebra in just a generic sense. I'm not talking about elementary algebra or algebra 2. I'm just saying the concept of algebra is an abstraction, what we call it, to doing 1 plus 1 is 2. It is what we would call analytical thinking. Okay, so algebra, when you're learning algebra and you're doing all this crazy stuff, what it's forcing you to do is thinking analytically. Now, so it's not so much about algebra and can you solve this algebra problem as it is can you think and analyze something and think your way through things. The other is where we see geometry, and there's a lot of overlap here, but in geometry was what we would think is critical thinking, thinking critically and some judgments and logically walking through proofs and using logic at all. We look in our society and we can turn on the television and we realize there is no logic. People don't care about logic. Look at the Facebook feeds and the arguments that happen back and forth, whether it be, about anything. There's no logic being used. They're just arguing and throwing insults. That's part of our culture because nobody's thinking clearly and critically. That may be fun or frustrating to you, depending on how you want to look at it. But look, the rest of when you're dealing with the world of business, when you're dealing with making decisions, you need some logical, analytical thinking. One of the biggest things we hear from industry is nobody is thinking critically or analytically anymore. And it's kind of weird as we step back, and because I'm constantly in front of industry leaders and asking them, what can we at the university be doing to help you? And you say it's not about the university at all. They're like, we need people to think critically and analytically. Boy, that is so true. That is what algebra and geometry and some of the science stuff, that's what that's doing for you. That's what it's teaching. So yeah, I don't care, whether you did 17 problems or 22 problems or whether you can remember the Pythagorean theorem, but you've learned to think analytically and critically. And boy, that's such an important thing in what you're going to be doing, because your kids in particular, if they're not going down a path of college, they need to be educated. They still need to be educated. As a matter of fact, they might become more educated. A friend of mine told me the other day, said his daughter skipped college. She went to she's now 19, I believe, and she is now working as in this company and doing something, making a living. And her kids, her friends who are in college, are looking at her and one day want to work for her. Right, because she's already working, she's already making a living, she's already making connections, she's already using the skills, she's growing in her education about how business works and the industry she's in, where her friends are in college still, and they're probably going to end up working for her. So going to college is not that magic bullet, but education is. Don't separate the two. Again, universities do not own education. We may be a path, but we're just one of thousands of paths. I mean, I'm saying that I beat that drum at the university constantly. I tell the other faculty members and administrators, we have to deliver, and we have to deliver the quality of education and not deliver the garbage that many of us know is out there. So let's think more about the mathematics. What about the mathematics? Why do you need mathematics? Algebra and geometry. And again, an analytical and critical thinking. I'm going to say one other thing. If you were like me, you remember seeing those word problems in algebra and geometry and all these other crazy math courses, and you hated word problems. Well, let me just tell you, life is a word problem. Everything that you get is, I've got this and I've got this. I'm trying to figure this out, right? Everything is a word problem. Nobody ever writes down for us equations to solve, and maybe we're thankful for that. So let me just give you some, as we were talking with some people the other day, talking about in business, just in business in general, whether you go to work for someone, whether you own your own business, whether you're going to start a lawn care company, where do you use mathematics? So we look at, we look at a lot of business plans. I work with a lot of business startups. We see break-even analysis. There's that analysis word, which is algebraic, it's graphing, profit tax calculations, basically algebraic type of things. I mean, it's a fairly consistent thing for what's the tax rates, what's the multiplication factors. That's algebra that's going on. Sometimes we don't think about it that as algebra, because maybe you and I have had algebra and we know enough about it. It's just embedded there. We think we don't remember algebra, but we're doing it all of the time because we had enough basis. But do your kids? Can they do it all the time? The product mix, one thing that we're always looking at is product mixes. When you got multiple products at multiple price points and you've got to invest money, you end up with mathematical models of trying to figure these things out and what's the best way to spend money in advertising. Some things in life are obvious, but it's so quickly in small businesses when things look obvious one day, and then even though they're a small business, thinking through things becomes analytical and mathematical very quickly. And I'm always shocked because sometimes you think, well, I can just look at the chart and see what's selling and see what's going. Well, it's not always that easy to make the best decisions. So let's go from business to finance. Finance, anybody doing anything financial calculations in terms of stock market calculations. Now, I know a lot of the tools are out there, but they're all loaded with mathematical formulas. You might not know this, but people in finance are taking courses like calculus because there's a lot of change and things that are going on in that. So finance formulas are loaded mathematical, analytical formulas. So the finance guys, whether they're trained by a university or they learn it on their own, they're very strong mathematically. But let's think about common everyday life. So we just experience things, and just think about conversations that go on. People talk about exponential growth. And we see this in the news media all the time. We see people using terminology. They don't really know what it means. What does it mean by exponential growth or decay? What does that mean? Until you've kind of seen it and looked at it, you don't really know the terminology and what it means. And sometimes not knowing terminology is dangerous. But you look at that acceleration, you hear carbon decay, carbon dating, cooking. And it's constantly, when you're cooking, how many times are we changing fractions? We're changing units. We're moving, breaking recipes in half or a quarter, doubling them. That's all algebraic thinking. So when you're teaching your kids that, hopefully you are teaching your kids that in the kitchen, then you're teaching them to think that analytical stuff. But if they have the basis of the math, that becomes much easier for them to understand what they're doing. One of the most frustrating things for me to see in business, and probably many of you feel the same, is that people who talk about something but who don't really know what they're talking about. Right? We see this all the time. They're using terminology, they're saying things, but they don't really understand anything. Their depth of knowledge is about that deep. And that's dangerous. We see this in industry all the time, where people who have depth of knowledge this deep, whether it's been financial calculations or anything, and they make bad decisions because they really don't understand what they're doing. And they haven't learned to think critically and analytically. We were talking to some people, sometimes just even understanding television, movies and TVs and literature and seeing what's in them, it takes some depth of education just to understand what they're talking about. Think about shopping, sales and discounts. How many calculations so many of you will do when there's so much percentage off, and some people just grab the stuff, but other people are thinking through and looking at every dollar spent. Well, that's mathematical calculations going on. So think about sports. How much is going on in sports? You watch these sports. There's a lot of statistical stuff. There's a lot of physics. There's a lot of training, but a lot of that is underlying, and especially the higher up you get in sports, there's a lot of analytical and scientific work that goes on. Anything with the word science in it, by the way, is mathematically based, whether it's physics and chemistry, or something like an economics, which maybe is not a science, but or sociology or something like that. There's a lot of analytical numbers type stuff in there. Think about music though, scales, octaves, the pitch, all those are describing human phenomena of sound. And all that sound is mathematical background, and understanding a little bit about the mathematics and the trigonometric relationships there can help us in that. At least certainly make it richer. Think about your hobbies. So my wife is working with a lady that does quilts to help do quilting for some of the many piles of clothes that we have from kids. And they're doing these geometric patterns. And so she's working with it geometrically, critically analyzing how to put these quilts together. It sounded simple to me, and then it starts getting complicated pretty quickly. Think about the geometry in carpentry. So if you're one of these DIYers, or you're just you're building anything. I remember many times doing trig on a site where we're building something. Me and my dad built a cabin at the lake, and when I was younger, and we were quite often, because it wasn't, we were kind of building it as we went. We were doing trig and calculations, trying to figure out things like the slope. And if you ever think about a stairwell and the tread of the stairs, and you want them to be the same height, and you want them to be the same depth, and the right angle. And if it's a basic calculation and you're in a nice place where you can do it the normal everyday way, then you can just look at a book. But in our case, we weren't. So we were having to calculate all of these things. And so if you even look at something like the little speed square that you use, so many of you may be familiar with, these markings on here are all ratios and trigonometric type based markings. So many people might not even know how to use these, but these are these tools that are based mathematically on the relationships of what's going on. So if we just think about this stuff that's going on. So yeah, Holly. So Holly's yes. Isn't it always the truth? Our kids are always asking us the question, and one of the things that used to frustrate me is people would say, "Don't ask." It's a fair question. It's a fair question to be asking. Why is this useful? And I think when you have to answer questions such as that, it helps you understand more. And so I will say one thing for your kids are asking that, have your kids dive into their hobby, get on Google, take their funnest thing they like, piano or whatever, and start investigating the mathematics of that. Make that their math assignment, and let them see the connections that are out there in the world, because they own it, and because also that I'm lazy, and that helps me because somebody else gets to do the work. That's the teacher's greatest tool at the university, is we hand the work to somebody else, and they go back, and then we look like a genius. So again, you're looking at all of these things. When you're laying carpet, you're calculating area, you're buying paint. Very often when we're buying paint, we're having to calculate the area. So we're remodeling a lot of stuff here in our home. Seems like a constant thing for me. And we're buying paint and odd walls. And so we're having to calculate this to get square footage. And then some paints go on thicker, and so many gallons per square foot. I mean, so many square feet per gallon. So then roof pitching, doing the roof pitch, it just goes on and on and on. These things that we consider common everyday things, they're there. Even understanding the speed driving down the road, the fact that we understand speed, that we have a feel for what it means, what acceleration means. And by the way, the relationship between your speed and your distance covered and accelerations is physics and calculus. It's all described in there. It doesn't mean you're going to break out a calculator expression and try to figure that out. Sherlock Holmes, though, there was an episode where Sherlock Holmes is driving. He's on a train, and he's calculating the velocity of the train. So by doing it, understanding that television show or that movie, I guess in that case, where he's doing that, we'd have to kind of understand the physics that he's doing, the basic mathematical calculations. So again, we're not trying to sell products or anything, but we're saying don't sell your kids short and say we're going to skimp on this because we're not going to educate you in an area because it's hard or something else. There's two things that we found that have been successful for us is to have your kids drive the education, or have our kids drive the education based upon their desire. So that may mean we don't go into something as deep than we might go into otherwise, but we also want to make sure they have basic, thorough knowledge of things to where they're capable of doing things. Again, the world is in need of people. I mean, if I look at companies, they cannot get enough talented people. I'm just going to say that flat out. I don't care what industry you are in. There's not enough talented people out there to do those jobs. And sometimes in engineering or nursing or things like that, there's certainly not enough trained, talented people. But having people who can think critically, I just hear that every time. And people will tell me, if you give me a kid who can use Google, who can think analytically and critically, and has integrity, I will find him work over and over and over again. As a matter of fact, I will probably hire him over college graduates often. So don't skip. Remember, algebra is analytical thinking. Geometry, and I mean, that's algebra 1, algebra 2. Geometry is critical thinking. And when you start putting them together in things like calculus and physics and chemistry and some of those courses, you're combining analytical and critical thinking and an understanding of how the world works. Fundamentally, mathematics is the language that's how the world's how the world is written. It's the mathematics behind. I mean, it's the language of science. So all of life is a word problem. I don't see that changing. I don't know about you, but it's constantly with life is that word problem that I used to dread or hate in math because who liked word problems. But then you realize that's the only kind of problems that there really are. Nobody sets up the equation for you. Nobody does the analysis for you. Nobody does the critical thinking for you. It's really up to you. And it's going to be up to your kids soon. So I hope that gives you something to think about. So just to do that, Casty will be back here with us on Thursday, and she will probably be talking about more specific examples about how to use that. But I did want to address that question of why are we talking about math and science, but math in particular, if you're not heading to college, and why is it important? And I hope I've given you at least something. If I haven't convinced you, I'll be open. I'll be the term to put the rock in your shoe, giving you something for you to think about and consider as you're making your plans for your school. So have a great night. Great to be with you.